Just curious, how many folks are still without power? All right, us too. So how many of you rotten scoundrels never lost power? Oh, you dirty dogs. That's just not fair. We'll talk with you after church. Do you get maybe the idea that God is trying to prepare us for whatever chaos might come after the election next week? Oh, how are we going to get them ready for this? Well, we'll send them COVID and we'll send them an ice storm and we'll just mess everything up. Take away their electricity for a week and see what happens. Maybe they'll be ready when that time comes. I really want to applaud a couple of things this morning. One, we have some great song leaders in this congregation, and I really appreciate the ministry that their song leading is to us. It is to me anyway. I hope it is to you, and it was obvious that Bobby put a lot of thought into this morning's song selection and the way he presents it. Just does a fantastic job. Even if he did select the song 9/11 for the invitation, I guess maybe that's very appropriate. If you think about what those numbers mean to us, you might want to come forward and make things right with the Lord. But also, just the fact that we've got leadership here to get something going like our disaster team. Appreciate Tom, the good work. And I know that guy didn't want to be mentioned that took care of the parking lot and everything, but at least his initials are Titus West, I'll tell you that. So he doesn't want recognition, but that boy needs some recognition because he's always doing something good around here and making somebody's life a little better. So we appreciate that. And there's just so much good that this congregation does, and I know you appreciate it. And I want to reiterate something Bob said in his prayer, praying for the safety of those who do go out and try to help. And if you're not able to go out, there's a lot of folks not able, for whatever reason, whatever circumstance, if you're not able to go out, please pray for us that do, because sometimes the situation is a little dangerous, and sometimes you have to contend with people like Bonnie, who says old people shouldn't be on roofs of their houses. So just take that, Bonnie. Yeah, we enjoy our work, but it is a little bit dangerous. I remember this spring, I wasn't paying attention, and I cut a limb that I thought was just safe to cut, but it was under tension, and it came back and hit me in the eye. I had a shiner for a couple days. That was just, anyway, that's the kind of stuff that can happen out there. So not everybody is as smart as me and knows how not to do that stuff now. So yeah, anyway, appreciate everybody that turns out. It's a great work. Well, let's talk about Daniel chapter 4, and the lesson's primarily going to come out of Daniel chapter 4, but it really sort of starts in Daniel chapter 3. We won't read all of chapter 3, but here's the gist of Daniel chapter 3, and you hopefully remember this story. If you don't, I'll kind of familiarize you with it. Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were put under a challenge that there was going to be a time when they had to bow down and worship the idol gods. And if they didn't, they'd be thrown into a fiery furnace, and they didn't. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, and God delivered them. As a matter of fact, when they looked into the furnace where those guys had been thrown, there weren't 3 guys, there were 4 guys, one like unto the Son of God. I wonder who that was in there with them, keeping them from being burnt. They brought them out of the fire. They hadn't even been touched with smoke. And if you've done any burning this week, you've been touched with smoke. These guys didn't even have the smell of smoke, even though they were in a furnace that should have burned them up post haste. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar says at the end of chapter 3 about that. Now remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, heathen, pagan, idolatrous king. This is what he says about God when he saw what God did for those 3 men. Verse 28 of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command," violating my command, he's saying, "and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Because that's the Christian thing to do. We're going to tear them limb from limb and reduce their houses to a rubbish heap. That was the impact that Nebuchadnezzar, seeing God's deliverance of these 3 men, brought in his mind and in his heart. He said, all right, I'm making a decree. You can't say anything bad about their God. Now this was a heathen, pagan, idolatrous king who through seeing what God did for them had his heart changed. Now when we get to chapter 4, I don't know if you noticed this or not when James was reading it, perhaps you already knew this. James 4 is from the mouth of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And chapter 4 is after the fact. In other words, what he's telling us about has already happened by the time he starts to tell us about it. And he's telling us what happened to him and what he thinks about what happened to him. If you go back to chapter 4, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, the king to all peoples, nations, and men of every language that live on all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me, Nebuchadnezzar, to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. Notice he says for me, he doesn't say to me. God didn't do anything to Nebuchadnezzar, he did something for Nebuchadnezzar. What a different way to look at it. He goes on to say this, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom and his dominion is from generation to generation. Remember that next week. However the election goes, whose is the kingdom and the power and the glory, as Jesus himself would put it? It's always God's. Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream and it made me fearful, and these fantasies as I lay on my bed and the visions of my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. You may remember that he had done that in chapter 2. He had a dream that troubled him in chapter 2, and he couldn't even remember the dream. So he had his wise men and his magicians and soothsayers come in, and he told them, I want you to tell me not only the interpretation of the dream, but first you got to tell me what the dream was, because I can't remember it. Man. Well, who was the only one able to tell him the dream and the interpretation? It was Daniel. Daniel was the only one, because Daniel was the only one through whom God was working. So now he's bringing him in, and at least this time he's going to tell him the dream. Verse 7, then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. But finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar. Now the name Belteshazzar means, may Bel preserve his life. Bel being a term for one of the heathen idolatrous gods of the Babylonians. That's the name that they gave Daniel. Daniel didn't take on it himself, they gave it to him. So that's what he calls him. According to the name of my God, that's the name, and in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, and then he tells him the dream, and the dream was this. I'll just tell you what the dream was. You can read through it down through the verse through 14, but there was this great big tree, and this tree spread out over the whole earth. Am I still on? We still amplified there? Spread out over the whole earth, and its foliage was beautiful, and it gave shade to everybody, and it had fruit, and every creature in the world would come and eat of that fruit and enjoy the shade and enjoy the fruit, and it was a blessing to everybody. And then all of a sudden out of heaven came a watcher from God, an angelic watcher, and that watcher came down and he cut the tree down and made everybody flee out from under that tree. But when he cut the tree down, he put metal bands around the stump. And that's the dream that he saw, and he didn't know what in the world this dream was all about, and it troubled him, it bothered him. And so Daniel gives him the interpretation. But in verse 15, he recalls this about the dream. Verse 15, chapter 4. Listen carefully. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of. What just happened? We went from talking about an it that was the tree to a him, because the tree symbolized a person, and that person was Nebuchadnezzar. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence, he says, is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know. Now, when you see that, when you read that, you need to take notice. All of this has happened in order that what? In order that the living may know something. What is it that the living need to know? Verse 17, that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whom he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men. Boom, there it is. Who is God in this world? He is the one who sets up kingdoms and brings them down. And he doesn't do it at a whim. He does it all with reason. And who does he put over nations? The best of men? The highest of men? The most profoundly talented of men? Who does he put over nations according to this angelic watcher? The lowliest of men. What does that say about our list of presidents? Now, I'm not making any commentary about any of those guys individually, but if you go back and you start looking at guys, one of the worst things you can do in history is to read biographies of people that you have respect for. Because you'll find out, oh, they're not as good as I thought they were. They're not the guy that I thought was straight from God. Well, they might have been from God. They might just act like very godly people. Nevertheless, who else has God got? Who else is there in the world but people just like you and me with the same weaknesses, the same subjection to temptation, the same misconceptions, the same bad set of ideas? There's no perfect pool of men somewhere from which God can go and say, I'm going to make that guy king, or I'm going to make him president, or he's going to be governor next week because he's perfect and he's way above everybody else. You just don't find a pool of men like that. And you don't have a pool of women like that. You don't have a pool of anybody like that. Who have you got to put over nations? People just like the folks in those nations. So that's who we get. One of the marvelous things about being in America is at least we have some kind of a say-so. We can make a vote. And I know sometimes we look at the selection and we go, is this the best we got? Is this all you got? It's like when you go to Walmart to buy a rifle. You say, really, is this all you got? Nothing bad against Walmart, but you know, the limited selection is what you find there. Now you go online and you think you can find everything. You want to go online and find a president? You want to go online and find a king? God sets over it whom he wishes. Whom he wishes. We vote, but God's the one who elects. He sets over it the lowliest of men. That's why all this is happening. That's why Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. And Nebuchadnezzar is relating this dream. He's the one telling us this dream. So Daniel interprets the dream, starting in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was appalled when he heard this dream, and his thoughts alarmed him. And evidently Nebuchadnezzar could see this. He could tell Daniel was troubled. And so he responded and he said, Belteshazzar, Daniel, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. And Daniel replied, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries, because he knew that this didn't sound like a good thing. Excuse me. Doesn't sound like a good thing either, does it? Where's my cough drops? Can you imagine this? You get the interpretation. By the way, this is why I stopped wearing coats and ties. When I get up here and I get hot, this happens. That'll be better. Have I told you about Fisherman's Friend before? Yeah, okay. All right. No commercials allowed in the pulpit. Here we go. Daniel gives the interpretation. The tree that you saw, verse 20, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which food was for all under the beasts of the field dwelt in those branches, and birds in the sky lodged. It's you, O king. You're the tree. You've become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And then he says, when that watcher comes down, he cuts you down, but he puts a metal band around the stump. So the tree's gone, but the stump is there, and it's got a band around it. And Daniel says, here's what's going to happen, king. You're going to be turned into a beast. And instead of hair like a man's body might have, you're going to have feathers. And instead of nails, you're going to have claws. And instead of eating at your table that you normally eat at, like a king would eat, you're going to be out in the field eating grass like an ox. And this is going to last for a period of 7 times. And he doesn't define how long that is. He just says 7. What does the word 7 mean in biblical parlance? 7 is the word for completion. That everything's come to, that's a complete and total number. It's the number for man is believed, which is 4, and man is on the earth, the 4 winds, the 4 corners of the earth, and the number for God, which is 3, Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. You put those 2 numbers together and you get a 7. Man and God is complete. So the number 7 represents completeness. So 7 times, a time of completeness is going to pass over Nebuchadnezzar while he is in this beast form until he realizes something, and that's in verse 25. Last part of verse 25. You're going to be a beast until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. That's the message to you, Nebuchadnezzar. Well, who's telling this story? Nebuchadnezzar's telling this story. So whatever was going to happen to him, by the time he tells it, it's already happened, and he has learned his lesson. He realizes that what God did was not to him, but for him, and he's come to his senses. Verse 28. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. He's telling it now like it's in the third person. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? Now, how long had this been since the dream? It had been a year. How soon we forget. While the word was in the king's mouth, it says, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you its declared sovereignty has been removed from you. Well, who can remove sovereignty from a king? Somebody with a higher sovereignty than the king. And the only one whose sovereignty is most high is the Most High. And God removes his sovereignty. And this is what happens. He's driven away from mankind. His dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time would pass over him until he recognized, again it said, that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And immediately it says in verse 33, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. And all of that happened. He became like an animal. He began to eat grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until the hair was grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. But at the end of that period, he says in verse 34, and you can circle or note verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. Isn't that an interesting way that he put this? Where did he raise his eyes? But towards heaven. And then what happened? His reason returned. Where do you get your ability to reason from? To me, one of the strongest evidences for creation by God rather than evolution is the fact that we have the ability to reason. We are self-aware. We have consciousness. Where does that come from by some physical, mechanical circuit? It can't. There's no way. That can only come from God. God gives us reason, and it is our reason that brings us back to God. And that's what's happening with Nebuchadnezzar. Heathen, pagan, idolatrous king though he is, he had recognized God's sovereignty and greatness with the incident with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But maybe he just kind of gone along with life and forgot about it. And then he has this dream about the great tree that's cut down. And he finds out, oh, that's about me. And after he gets that interpretation, a year later, then he starts vaunting himself up. But here's the thing. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom while he was in animal form? You remember the band that was put around the stump? That metal band represented the fact that God was going to preserve his kingdom until he would be restored by his reason. And that's exactly what happened. When Nebuchadnezzar recognized God, his kingdom was restored. Now you read the ancient history of the world, and that never happens. All through history, when a king had a throne, somebody was trying to get that throne away from him. Remember David? His own son, Absalom, trying to get the king away from him. Later on, once David was dead, Adonijah was trying to get the king away, and Solomon had Adonijah put to death because he was trying to get the throne. Herod, you remember Herod? Herod the Great, they called him Herod the Great, of all people to be called the Great. Killed his own wife, killed her 2 sons, later killed his firstborn son, killed his wife's grandfather, killed a whole slew of people because he was scared to death somebody was going to try to get his throne. You remember what Herod did when Jesus was born? The wise men came. Herod inquired of the wise men, what time was he born? And he figured, okay, by the time they said he was born, it was about 2 years. So he goes to Bethlehem, and what's he do? He slaughters all the children in Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger. Why? Because he's afraid somebody's going to take his throne. Nebuchadnezzar didn't have to worry about it. I don't know how long that period was, but it was a 7-time period, a time long enough for him to realize that God was the one who was sovereign, and he came to his senses when he raised his eyes to heaven, and he said that, and then his kingdom was restored. It was waiting for him. Nobody usurped it. Nobody took it. Nobody fought for it. That's pretty amazing when you stop and think about it. And that's the kind of thing that God does all the time. Amazing things. And Nebuchadnezzar learned the one lesson, that God's the one who's in control. That's the lesson we need to learn. God's in control. You got COVID, God's in control. God's not afraid of COVID. You got an ice storm, tears down all your trees. Oh, that's such beautiful trees in our backyard. You know, we're going to be all right without those trees. I'm praying that when I get up in those trees to cut some of those limbs out, that God's going to be all right with me. And he's going, Marty, hold on to that limb right there. He's going to take care of me. Pray for me. Got to cut those tree limbs out. But we can live without those trees. It seems to me we can live without almost everything but God. And he seems to be the one thing that so many folks in the world are trying to get out of their lives. He's the one constant. He's the one we can depend on. He's the one who has the means and the will and the passionate desire to provide for you and me. If he hadn't shown us that on the cross, I don't know what else he could show us. And no matter what happens next week, it's God who puts people on thrones and pulls them off. It's God who watches over nations and individuals. It's God, it's God, it's God. It's just like, and we'll close with this text from the first chapter of Luke's Gospel. Luke chapter 1. This is Mary. Mary is with child. Guess who that child is? Of course, it's Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. She has that child in her. She goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth. Guess what condition Elizabeth is in? Well, she's 6 months along with John the Baptist in her womb. Not full-grown John the Baptist. We're talking little baby John the Baptist in her womb, 6 months old. And when Mary goes in to see Elizabeth, and Mary says that when your voice was heard in my child's ear, he leaped in the womb. Boy, if that's not a testament right there for the fact that you're a human being, even in the womb, I don't know what could be. But Mary goes on. Boy, I can't get names right this morning. Larry goes on. Sorry, Larry. I have to apologize to Harold and Larry this morning. Mary goes on to say in verse 46, my soul exalts the Lord, and my spirit has rejoiced in God my Savior, for he has regard for the humble state of his bondslave. For behold, from this time on all generations will count me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And mercy, his mercy, is upon generation after generation towards those who fear him. He has done mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who were proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted those who were humble. Mary, in receiving the child, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, reminds us God is still the one in control. He gives his son to a young virgin girl and shows in that he is yet sovereign. And his son who came to that virgin girl was born, grew up to be a Savior who died for us all. And he's shown us his sovereignty even in that, declaring his righteousness in forgiving us of our sin. So next week, don't be anxious. Don't let your thoughts trouble you. No matter how it goes, no matter what the claims, no matter what the fallout, we don't trust in any government. We trust in God. We don't trust in any election. We trust that we are the elect of God. He's chosen us because we have chosen him, and that is where our confidence should always lay. So, with that said, we're going to stand and sing 9/11. If that shouldn't remind us of a time that God's brought us through, I don't know what will. Let's stand and sing the invitation song for anyone who needs to respond this morning.